Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to Spent Fuel Solutions second quarter webinar. My name is Jessica Ludenauer and I am the Coalition Manager of Spent Fuel Solutions, and I'm very happy to be here this morning hosting this event for you. As some of you know, over the past few years, we've featured speakers from several of the consortia that are working with the Department of Energy on their collaboration-based siting process. In the past, we've hosted Energy Communities Alliance, and then just recently, back in March, Mothers for Nuclear. Today's guests are from another consortium that is led by the Keystone Policy Center, which looked at how communities make decisions around complex infrastructure projects and how they can be empowered to meaningfully participate in a site selection process. They also looked at communities' experiences living with spent fuel, the needed roles of states and tribes in siting deliberations, and the experiences of communities in other countries' repository siting processes. Keystone is a nonprofit that's dedicated to driving actionable shared solutions to policy challenges through independent, collaborated problem-solving solutions. Excuse me. We're pleased to welcome Brad Sperber, who serves as Keystone's director for the Center for Civic Engagement and Capacity Building. Joining him are Tom Webler, who is the Senior Research Fellow at Social and Environmental Research Institute, or SERI, and Roy Payne, the Executive Director of GDF Watch. SERI's research focuses on social and environmental issues with an emphasis on public participation and decision-making, human dimensions of risk and environment, and vulnerability and environmental change. GDF Watch is a UK-based organization that helps individuals and communities understand and participate in the discussion around geological disposal of spent fuel. We'll start off, as we usually do, with a presentation, followed by Q&A about Keystone's work on collaboration-based siting and some of the feedback that they received from various communities during the process. And of course, if time permits, we will take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please drop it in the chat and we will do our best to get to it. We did receive a couple of questions in advance and we will do our best to get to those as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the Keystone Consortium for a presentation.
Okay, so I'm Tom Webler and I'll be giving the presentation today. Brad and Roy will jump in as they will and probably do more with questions answering. Our partnership included, led by Keystone, SERI, that's my organization, I'm in Massachusetts, GDF Watch is in London, and NARC is the National Association of Regional Councils. That's in Washington, D.C., and unfortunately, no one from that group could join here today, but they've been a partner throughout this from the very beginning. So as Jessica noted, we were funded by the DOE as one of the 13 consortia. So here, what we thought we'd do today is just tell you, briefly about what we're doing here. Our focus is on community acceptance and community involvement. Really, that is our specialty. We've all worked in that area, and we've engaged over the last couple of years with communities, tribes, states, and individuals from different international countries where there's been work to develop a deep geological repository. So we'll talk about three findings here that we want to highlight from our work. The first one is about civic capacity, and we'll go into that in a little detail in a minute. The second has to do with process design, how to design and run a good process. And the third has to do with engagement itself. I think this is pretty much, your standard slide everybody would show you. There's a lot of spent nuclear fuel. I just wanted to highlight the kind of the fourth and fifth bullet points to the right, or exclamation triangles to the right, that DOE funded 12 consortium to investigate consent-based siting for consolidated and storage. And when this started, we were asked to work with environmental justice communities to not wholly, but made sure we worked with environmental justice communities. Later on, after a new administration came in, there was a shift from consent-based to now we're going to talk about collaboration-based, and which still raises questions that we have about what that means for community power. And as you probably know, the DOE put out an RFI, request for information, that would shift responsibility for dealing with waste onto states. Okay, so what did we do? From San Diego to Maine, we got around the country quite a bit. We started working in Lower Richland, South Carolina. This is a historically Black rural community just to the east of Columbia. Um, and we were there for several meetings and several community gatherings and trainings. Then we moved to the Upper Arkansas area of central Colorado, where we worked with a council of governments that included 4 different counties. We came up to New England and developed a partnership with the Connecticut River Partnership, which is a volunteer regional organization about watershed protection. Then we met with activists and community members from New England nuclear plant communities, Seabrook, Rowe, Vernon, Millstone, and so on, all Wiscasset. Went down to San Onofre to work with the community engagement panel and had a program with the Association of Ohio Councils of Governments. On the right, you'll see a list of different stakeholders that we also engaged with. So the ones on the left are kind of the more intense community involvement. So the ones on the right varied. Some of these people were invited to meetings that we held. Brad went to TrimTech and gave a talk, and worked with different councils of governments in Ohio, Texas, Minnesota, and so on. We brought in one individual from Sweden, one from Switzerland, one from UK, and one from can't see that because the screen's in the way, but what was the other country, Roy? I'm spacing out. Sweden? Oh, Canada,
Canada.
of
Yeah.
course.
And Tom, on that last slide, could I just unpack the acronym or the abbreviation
Yeah.
TRIMTech? That's the Tribal Radioactive Materials Transportation Committee, also funded by a different Department of Energy grant. Thanks.
Correct. And public participation professionals. All right. So our findings. Community capacities. We found that communities needed 6 different types of capacities in order to engage meaningfully. And this was essential to a successful process. Process design had to be co-design, regional, stepwise, and anchored in deliberation and information integrity. The engagement principles focused on the importance of skilled independent facilitation by professional facilitators who are independent of the process, who are proactive about including all parties, and who build trust through appropriate behaviors. And all these things are, of course, interrelated, right? You need civic capacities as kind of a fundamental unit, but without a good design, the capacities aren't really utilized to their best degree possible. And even if you have a good design, if you carry out poorly by engaging poorly, well, you've kind of made poor use of your good facilitation design. So let's go into these findings here. What do we mean by civic capacities? We mean these 6 different things. And I would note that usually when DOE talks about community capacities, they're thinking about expert knowledge. Okay, and that is one of the elements here, knowledge access. But other important elements include leadership, formal and informal leaders who are elected and non-elected, sometimes just like a neighbor who starts a Facebook group or something like that. That could be a type of leader. Resources. Time is one of the most important resources, and we'll say more about how time is comes into these siting processes, but communities need spaces to meet in. They need technology for you know, doing remote communications and also just to do the kind of outreach participation that's needed. Knowledge access, we focus on our community, and we learn these things from speaking to people at the communities, I should say. So people mention the importance of usable, valid information and having access to independent experts. Civic skills is refers to a whole collection of things about what we need to do local democracy well, right? People need to be able to deliberate and reason. They need to be able to examine and validate information for its correctness and appropriateness. They need to be good at consensus building. And yes, bring in professional facilitation, but people also need to have these skills. By network benefits, we mean trusted relationships where different groups in the social network of the community are aligned on values and that they're connected to each other in multiple ways, and that there's a sense of mutualism, which is, you know, the idea that groups benefit each other by their relationships. And finally, civic culture. This is the importance of a shared collective identity, shared commitment to norms, a vision for the community's future that's oriented to the common good. So why are these so important? Well, you know, there's concern among the people we spoke with that well-resourced interests would try to capture a process and drown out the voices of residents, local people who are going to be directly affected. So they need skills in order to participate effectively. Marginalized voices are sometimes excluded, so a good process needs to do outreach to them, and the civic capacities here involve, you know, the network benefits, using your social networks to bring in all kinds of voices. Information asymmetry, we have to validate this information in these deliberative settings because, as we all know, misunderstanding is rife through social media. Without good leadership and really a commitment by the community to a shared vision, political leaders can suffer backlash and lose their positions because of taking unpopular stances. And if you don't build an authentic consensus, communities can later on just disavow what everyone thought was agreed to. So in other words, on the right side here, whatever the siting organization is, whether it was DOE, whether it's a Fed Corp, whether it's a new corp, whether it's states now, or something like that, they need to be in doing these things that we've checklisted on the right side of this slide, building capacity. So let's jump on to the second finding here about process design. What did we find out about what community members wanted from process design? Deliberation. They want to talk about things. They don't want to be educated. This whole phrase, educate the public, we've got to educate the public. People heard that a lot and they find it a bit pejorative. Yes, people want knowledge, but they want to be treated as equals who have an important point of view and can deliberate and reason as a fellow human being can. So the process needs to be fair and competent. Fair means there's appropriate, inclusive voices for all, and competent means that the shared understandings are accurate, relevant, and morally appropriate. So whatever community norms there are, these should be examined and claims should be made that are consistent and respectful of those norms. On the right, regionality. This was an important finding for us, is that communities, a lot of communities, and this is very prevalent in New England, where power plants tend to be sited Like the New Hampshire plant is sited right on the border of Massachusetts. The Vermont power plant is sited right on the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. The Massachusetts Rowe plant was sited on near Vermont. So communities that are nearby power plants are often just as affected as those that host the plant themselves. So we heard from Switzerland where they use a regional conference approach to bring in perspectives from affected local communities. And finally, go slow to go fast. This is this important issue of time I hinted to earlier, that a rush to try to get this done according to some preconceived timetable will likely fail. Uh, as Roy likes to say, we can only move at the speed that the community can move at the speed of the community's trust. So just a quick background slide to that one. What do we mean by a good process? Well, stepwise design with multiple opt-outs. This used to be called consent. Now it's called collaboration, but we still believe there need to be exit points, go, no-go points at each phase of this process where a community can decide whether to keep going or not. The second important point to bring up on this slide is about information integrity, is that there needs to be a way for this community of practice, this process, to examine falsehoods and facts and falsehoods, try to separate out the untruths or the unjustified claims from those that have empirical justifications, to separate out false or misleading normative claims. And that's where people often try to represent common or community interest in a distorted manner that benefits one particular special interest group. And finally, this idea of emotional acceleration. We all know that nuclear issues have high propensity for emotional content about the associated risks. And so these emotions, they don't need to be pushed out of the process, but they need to be worked into the process in a reasonable way. The third of our three findings here has to do with engagement. And people told us how they wanted to be engaged, right? They recognize that engagement can be distorted if it's led by an individual or an organization with a material interest in the outcome. So having independent organizations doing the engagement is an important process, is an important element of the process. I'm not going to go through all these points here, but a sound engagement process, there are frameworks out there to do that, and people know how to do this well. It's been studied by professionals in many different fields over decades and decades. The importance of professional facilitation is very is essential to a successful process, and that these people ought to be hired and chosen by the community that is considering hosting a facility, not hired by DOE or whoever is responsible for the siting. And just on the right there, the hard to engage populations, there are always people who are easy or quick to show up to a meeting, right? And they do not necessarily always represent the entire community. So there's a need to actually do a lot of groundwork and reach out again through those networked pathways that you've got with other organizations to bring in all perspectives. We're going to have two slides here, I think 2 or 3 slides that elaborate on this points of engagement. And the first has to do with trust. As this person said, show up in person, be honest, be trustworthy, be transparent about your intentions and limitations, make personal connections. Trust is built through deeds, not words. Be patient with not being trusted, especially in the early stages. And much has been written about this, and much of what we've heard is consistent with what's been heard before. Uh, if you look at the third point down on the left side, listen before informing. This isn't about educating the public. It's not about coming and giving them a lecture on how isotopes change in a fission reaction. People want to be heard. They want to know that the siting organization recognizes they have a community with identity that wants to be protected, that wants to develop its sense of who they are. And this siting up might be an opportunity to do that. The second of the slides here is tribal engagement, and this is again something I think many of us have heard before. If you look on the first point, government to government for federally recognized tribes, they are not just stakeholders to be treated as equivalents with other groups. They are actually sovereign nations that ought to be treated as at a federal government to tribal government level. If you look on the right side, what we heard from tribes, don't ask us to participate in your process. Ask us to help design it from the beginning, right? So these are important characteristics that we've heard from several different tribes we engaged with. All right, so what communities told us, what concerns do they have? They're concerned about the lack of federal clarity, what's being asked of them. When we started this, it was about citing a constant CISF, Consolidated Interim Storage Facility, which is now called the Consolidated Storage Facility. But a lot of talk in our conversations was about a deep geologic repository because we had many people tell us that according to law, that the DOE cannot cite a consolidated storage facility until a deep geological repository has been licensed. So we went through these kind of discussions, and we had to admit that it is rather unclear as to what DOE was asking at the time. Of course, there's the fear that temporary storage will become permanent. There is a lot of environmental justice considerations that lower status, lower or more impoverished communities will be asked to accept a facility. And there's something called situational coercion, where a community doesn't really have a legitimate choice because it simply has no other choice but to accept any kind of economic development, even if it's one they don't really want. Problems with jobs being actually materializing. I think we've all heard about that in many projects. And of course, we heard that there were communities living with independent storage, independent independent site storage installations. I forget what that stands for, but where the casks are already located, and many of them feel those casks are safe. And so there's a mix out there. Our core recommendations: build capacities, engage in a regional stepwise deliberative process, and engage with professional independent facilitation. So how do we put all this stuff to work here? Just trying to wrap up in our 20-minute time. With the new RFI that asked for states to propose nuclear life cycle innovation campuses, we feel like the work we've come up with is applicable to this, and it's applicable to lots of different siting issues. And toward that end, we've developed a few resources. One is the community taxonomy, or community civic capacity taxonomy, which is a way of thinking about what capacities communities have. We did this in many places, went out and appraised their capacities, and then demonstrated how to build capacity in certain ways. We put together a community guidebook for consolidated storage siting process, but that also could be applied to other contexts as well, such as siting small modular reactors or even building non-nuclear infrastructure. The National Association of Regional Councils put together a web-based toolkit for regional communities. That's to work on planning for energy infrastructure. And then we have a curriculum for information integrity validation, how this was specifically for councils of governments, how they can go through and examine information and suss out misinformation. And then we have this, a process design framework for a stepwise process. So here's a link to those two of those documents, the community guide and the guide to from NARC from integrating energy into regional planning. And I'm just going to end it there, leave this slide up if people want to take pictures of those QRs and get access to those right away. And we can move on with questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you can send us these links, we'll also post them on our social media accounts after the webinar.
Okay.
All right, so jumping into our Q&A, again, if anyone has a question they'd like to submit, please put that in the chat. You talked about the common themes that you found specifically as it relates to spent fuel storage and disposal. But what types of common themes do you see across all types of controversial infrastructure projects, including consolidated storage?
Hey, this is Brad Sperber from Keystone. Thanks so much for that broad question, Jessica. I think the scope of it corresponds very much to how we entered this project, wanting to understand what's distinctive about siting, disposition, storage of used nuclear fuel, and what of the dynamics that we're curious about that we're encountering really are applicable to a wide range of infrastructure and siting decisions. So some common themes that we encountered, I would say complicating factors. One is a pretty stubborn general frustration toward distrust of big institutions and credentialed expertise. Not just federal government, but state also at the local level. And oftentimes for skepticism regarding the motives and capabilities of big industry. Tom spoke a lot about civic capacity, and so local communities will vary in what capacities they have, you know, in plenty and where their deficits are. But I think occasionally we've seen instances of a well-designed, principled engagement process going off the rails because the community simply wasn't equipped for rigorous, sustained engagement, whatever the kind of facility or infrastructure. Also, it's I think we've observed challenges on the part of the siting authority, public or private sector, in moving at the speed of information. Tom talked about information integrity, which is shorthand for the importance of being attentive to misinformation, disinformation, misinformation being information someone happened to get wrong, disinformation, the purveyor knows it's wrong. This is meant to mislead, to shade the truth. And we've seen all around the country, especially in regional settings, but really any kind of community, the profound impact of just the challenge of agreeing on what's true. I think poorly designed and mismanaged public involvement processes oftentimes will fail to achieve the goals of fairness or competence. So we learned to be very curious going in to ask any given regional community, um, what are your expectations or traditions for how you gather, how you deliberate together? And do you feel like that's working well for you? If the expectation, just as a matter of tradition and lack of imagination, the expectation is we're going to put everybody in the high school gymnasium or the convention center, and people know they get their 2 minutes to stand in front of a microphone and speak their truth to whoever's at the front of the room. That's performative. It's not deliberative. So we would, ask, diplomatically, humbly, um, are you open to other ways of engaging that are more inclusive, more deliberative, that really, you don't get to you get to ask your question, but you're also expected to be interested in the answer. And hopefully that starts a conversation.
Great, thank you. So you did a lot of work across the country in various communities. How did the concerns that you heard differ from community to community and within different geographic regions?
Hmm. Um, Concerns, I would say, distrust or skepticism, was contextual. It was contingent. So we learned to ask, tell us about the the recent history or history spanning generations of your community's experience with X, whether X is a kind of technology or a kind of authority. Um, Equations for the calibration of power would vary. Do the community feel empowered, well informed? Um, I think we've touched on some of these themes already. Tom, Roy, anything you would add?
Yeah, I suppose from while of course, if you're looking at South Carolina, you're looking at New England, Southern California, there's going to be articulated differently. But I think what probably is striking is the similarity, and not just across America, but even internationally. When we brought people from Switzerland, Canada, UK, and Sweden to the US, was the shared experience, which is it tends to be a smaller, more isolated community. There can be a sense of being isolated and overwhelmed, a little bit sort of put upon by this great weight of government and large institutions. And hence the importance of developing capacity. They will be different because different communities are in different stages. But the and that was sort of the area where we've been always sort of exploring and used in our research was if you can feel isolated and overwhelmed, who might be your friend? We all look for it as individuals. If you're feeling overwhelmed by life or situation, you reach out to friends. Can you develop a community a community of communities who are all going through very similar experiences? What can they teach each other? And that's as much about the emotional reaction as it is about verifying data and understanding technical concepts. Because again, certainly with nuclear, the laws of the universe apply equally in Southern California as they do in central Switzerland. Um, so if there's been some, analysis and interrogation of data, it's probably consistent in each country or each community because uranium decays at certain rates, copper decays at certain rates. Um, one of the joys of science is that you can have some consistency and able to compare. So that experience, you don't have to relitigate. So I think that was my takeaway from it was actually the consistency of experience, even if articulated slightly different from different places.
That's interesting. So based on those consistencies and some of the concerns that you heard, what would you say are the biggest barriers to the successful siting of both consolidated storage and ultimately a repository?
Um, I think actually the biggest barrier actually is the mindset of authority in the industry. This idea that you've got to educate people, and that the industry we talk about trust. and that the industry and government wants the community to trust them. But there's an element also trust is two-way. And if you're going to empower and actually have a more participative, deliberative approach, there's an element of trust in the community, and actually working with them and having trust and faith that they will be honest and good actors. And certainly the experience from around the world is, if empowered, communities do behave responsibly. So there's an element of, for me, the biggest barrier is about attitude and mindset to actually having this as a deliberative process. If you can actually open up your mind, the processes will flow through from that. It's as much about changing an historical perspective that somehow we have to convince and educate a community, rather than, no, let's work with this community and together we'll find a solution that works for them and works for us.
Can I just add consistency to this too? I mean, we all started under Biden. Things are different. The government has not had a consistent strategy here. And I think as far as I know, all the consortium were completely blindsided by the RFI. Had no idea what was coming out of DOE. And the whole idea that now it's states going to take this on. It's just like, and what are they doing? Boreholes? They're doing storage, they're doing reprocessing, they're doing DGR. We don't know. We still don't know. And the laws are, the laws are what they are, but everybody talks about them needing to change, but we have no idea what's going to change when. And without any clarity, what do you expect from the public? Except a lack of trust and the high suspicion, like, why should we get involved with this?
Could I just add on the subject of my favorite T word, trust, which we're using consistently. In this context, in many of these community settings, distrust of power from outside the community, the federal government, the state, the industry, what have you, it may be decades, generations old. And I think we would caution against an engagement strategy that tried to front load and accelerate trust building. It's important that we all trust one another in order to get to stage one. I would say, I have found myself at times saying, we're not expecting you to trust XYZ. We're not even expecting you to trust us because you know what horse we rode in on. But we are inviting you to an opportunity to co-create a process of engagement that you can trust, or if trust is still too loaded a word, that you have confidence in, up until the next decision-making juncture. I'm thinking of Tom's slide with all the different exit ramps.
That's a good point, and I want to expand a little bit on trust. You've talked about other countries' experience with a repository and how there are a lot of similarities. When we have hosted representatives from other countries citing programs in the past, we've heard a lot about there being different levels of trust at the outset, and how that might complicate the citing process here in the US. Can you talk a little bit about how you think that might be overcome and what lessons we could learn from other countries?
I think this is for Roy.
Yeah, I'll start this one off, and you two gents will both have your
And
own
talk about the
contributions.
trust relationship in the UK, Roy.
Yeah, and I think there's also lessons to be learned, which are perhaps like learning from errors and mistakes as well as from the positives. And there's a certain I've got sympathy as an ex-public servant, but there is this whole issue of certainly in the UK, the very conservative and risk-averse nature of the organisation that is leading the citing process, and therefore worried if they say too much or if they give away too much. But trust building is, as we said before, is about your relationship and how you build a relationship with people. They don't have to trust you initially. Different groups within that community will trust you at different levels and different speeds. Trust can be lost very quickly. And so the UK, I think, is a good example of where if you don't properly empower or actually trust the community, they will pick up on that and then they will actually become more defensive, and it becomes much more difficult to have a dialogue. If you look, and elsewhere, Sweden, Switzerland, in particular, two places that I'm acquainted with, they took time to actually build a dialogue. Because of the length of time it takes to characterize a site, to go through the technical aspects of it, you can utilize that to your benefit. And rather than having, I think one of the lessons we learned is do not make this a binary decision. Would you like one of these facilities or not? Because you're always going to get a negative answer. The issue is actually to actually have a much more parallel and open dialogue, which actually talks to the community about their aspirations. What is it they're looking for? What are their concerns? Some of which may not be technical, maybe seem even irrational to a nuclear engineer, but are very powerful and important to that community. Therefore, they need to be treated with respect. So I think it's more a case of seeing this as a dialogue. And Brad, pointed out, intergenerational. It's not a barrier so much; it's just a recognition. This is going to take time. The whole process, whether it's a technical process and assessing a site through the community engagement, nothing happens quickly. And so if we look on average, the sort of period from starting a process to, should we say, the first spade in the ground is typically 20 to 30 years. That's how it operates, has happened in Canada, in Europe. So again, we're looking at the RFI, and I know there is probably, there are those in administration who want to, things to happen within, the next 12 months. There is just a sort of certain reality of just the laws of the universe and the steps you have to take. It just takes time, and that you need to be looking at a process which is going to be over 20, 30 years. And that is an opportunity to build a relationship, that you don't just make it a binary, the classic, decide, announce and then defend, but actually walk through a process with a community and be open and honest about what the risks are, because there will be risks. They need to understand what the risks are. Leaving the front door of a house is a risk, but every day we all make these risks. But if you actually have an open and honest discussion and a transparent way, you can take communities with you on that path, even if they eventually decide not to host because they've evaluated it. But having that process, that dialogue, they can make an informed decision.
Switching
Brad?
gears. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just making sure my colleagues were happy with it. They had nothing more to add to that.
All right. Switching gears for a minute. So Keystone was one of 12 consortia awarded funding by DOE. What sets your approach apart from the other consortia?
Well, I think some factors or characteristics that have already been expressed, really a combination of testing and then insisting on a regional approach, in the interest of being more inclusive. Not inclusion as some kind of abstract principle, but really viewed through a pragmatic lens. If I'm representing a particular municipality or even a county, without engaging my neighbors or communities along the transportation route. Other communities, other narrowly defined local communities will have their own ideas about whether they have a stake in decisions that I'm going to make. Are they going to be affected? Should they share in some of the benefits if they share in the risks? And that more inclusive scope really led us, maybe uniquely within the coalition, to realizing that states, in addition to tribal nations and tribal communities, needed to be involved at the outset, whether they're taking the lead or simply in parallel processes moving at roughly the same speed, interacting with all these different tiers or pathways of learning and deliberation and eventually decision making. So engaging the states and engaging the tribes from the outset rather than waiting until a proposal was fairly well baked and then it would be subject to a binary choice, yes or no, with other stakeholders, other authorities that have that retain the power to oppose effectively. Let's build them in from the beginning rather than put off their involvement, oftentimes out of fear that a no will be effective coming from them. Certainly our focus on civic capacities, on the civic elements of this kind of learning and decision making. Tom, Roy, anything I'm missing?
Well, I just think it's worth mentioning that we also started by looking at non-nuclear communities.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people like to say, well, it's easier, it's going to be built, you're going to build storage or a repository at an existing reactor facility like in Finland and Sweden, but there's no reactor at Bourg in France. There's no reactor in Zurich Canton where they're citing that, or there's no reactor at WIP, and there's no reactor at Ignace, Canada. So, of the 6 deep geological storage facilities that are cited or nearly cited or are built and operational, 4 are at non-nuclear sites. So we started by working with non-nuclear communities, also because just the level of emotional acceleration was lower there.
I think there was a difference. Just going back to the differences, it's a phrase I use. I know it's a personal phrase I've developed. This is all about civics, not science, and that it's not just about conveying science more efficiently. It is actually about understanding of the complexities of a process of a decision of this nature. How many different moving pieces have to be aligned over a long period of time? That's a very different approach than just how do people understand radiological issues. So if you're going to move a society process forward, it's understanding that decision-making dynamic as well. And I think one final point from me, I think the approach we took, we end up speaking to representative organizations at state level, of tribes, of communities, municipalities, of regional government. I'd like to think that the sorts of recommendations and findings that we now have with the IRFI process as a real world process, that our approach is actually rooted in a shared and collaborative approach from people who are in that process, who will be determining, shaping that process. So I'm hoping that what we're proposing is an expression of the perceived wisdom and the collaborative outcomes from discussions with all these different players who will be involved in the real world.
So we've heard about some of the challenges and barriers that need to be overcome in order to successfully site a facility. What do you think are the greatest opportunities when it comes to siting?
Well, for a community, the opportunity is for it to become more impassioned, more empowered to become the community it wants to be, right? So for us, we believe like communities need to have this vision for who they want to be. And if they want to be, like Carlsbad wanted to be the host for WIP, they came to an understanding of that. And then this opportunity allowed them to realize that outcome, right? To be what they wanted to become. And we respect, whether our personal feelings about this don't matter. For us, it's about the right for communities to determine for themselves how they want to develop and change over time. And if they choose to be a host community for a consolidated storage or for a reactor or for a deep geological storage or whatever they choose, that's up to them. We just think like the opportunity here is for them to build capacity and to think through the pros and cons of the opportunities that are available to them and to decide whether it's consistent with what they want to be. Because it'll never work to force this on a community. I think everybody's seen that from, any attempt, any hint that you're going to force it on a community will be met with a big pushback and a delay that will, push this off another generation.
Just to pick up on that point, the opportunity for the community and for the region, and it's not just one individual community.
Oh, when I say
Uh,
community, I mean region.
The region. But before the RFI was published, we were hearing from different people that there needed to be a sort of re-narration, that the way in which it was typically, would you like one of these, isn't the best way to advance a conversation, and that there needed to be a re-narration and an understanding why should a region take on responsibility. What was the national imperative? What role was it playing? And I think what we've seen with not just with the RFI, but more broadly, current events, the whole issue of energy independence, energy security, energy diversity, the sources of energy, have all become much more of a public debate, just given the world we live in these days. So the RFI again does, in its own way, once they decide which particular areas, it doesn't really matter where they go, there is going to be this discussion about, which is around what is it our region, our state, our communities want from this investment. How are we participating in a national endeavor? How are we supporting the national security? So it changes the dynamic from simply, do you want a building full of nuclear waste, to what are we trying to achieve here, and what are the national imperatives? So it creates a different dynamic and a different basis for have that conversation about your community. What do you see for your community and its role within a broader national landscape?
And Brad has some long-term experience with this way back when with the Office of the Nuclear Negotiator, working with the Mescalero Apache, right, Brad?
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
that
back
was
in the
kind
early
of
to mid 90s.
and that was part of a voluntary process too,
Mhm.
right?
All right, well, we have about 7 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we do have a few questions from the audience.
Good.
I think it's really interesting that you spoke to both nuclear and non-nuclear communities. Can you speak to whether you saw any differences or key similarities across those different types of communities in terms of the feedback that you received?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to generalize from a small sample, right? So I think there isn't any clear mark that you would say that all existing nuclear communities think this way and all non-nuclear communities think this way. It's a giant gray area, right? And so, but in general, communities recognize the importance of civic capacity, that they want to be empowered and they want to be able to talk about things without ending up neighbors fighting and being angry at neighbors, right? They want to get along, they want to have good jobs, they want to feel good about their life. And in that way, everyone's the same, right? They want to feel safe, they want to have opportunities, and they want to have a strong civic culture. They want to know their neighbors and get on good terms with them. And America has a history of, since de Tocqueville, right, of local democracy and strong democracy. And I think people are proud of that. Wherever you go, we see that.
I think one of the takeaways I took from meeting some of the non-nuclear communities, as much as discovered elsewhere in the world, is take nuclear out for the moment. It's just being at a local level, a community or a municipal level. It's just the time, the skills, and that projects can be brought to you, you have simply no idea whether they could add value and benefit your community. You just don't have the skills, the time. So you often say no because the dynamics of the community and the workload you already have, it's just too much. Um, and that therefore one of the things is why, not just the capacity, but the appropriate resourcing, that this has to be additional to whatever they're all local government everywhere around the world is underfunded. The demands upon it to provide services and day-to-day support to the community. If they're going to take on something significant about such as a nuclear waste facility or any large infrastructure project, they probably need additional resource to actually have the bandwidth, staff bandwidth, the time bandwidth, as well as the skills bandwidth to actually be able to engage this in a proper way so they can, as Tom indicated, properly assess what are the benefits for their community.
All right, thank you. So moving into some of our questions from the audience, we received some questions about the safety of canisters and testing. I think there's a lot we don't know about how that will be done with respect to a spent fuel storage facility. But have you seen any quantitative analysis of the risks associated with spent fuel storage canister confinement breaches?
Well, the only thing I know of, I saw Gordon Thompson presented at the Pilgrim ENDCAP meeting about the risks of the amount of radiation stored in the casks, and people at Pilgrim Watch or Cape Wind Downwinders would be able to connect people to that presentation.
And going back to trust, how can communities be sure that whomever is doing the outreach as part of this process is being honest about the risks associated with potentially hosting a site?
Brad, do you want to?
Sorry, I think I missed the question. Would you restate it?
Sure. So during this process, how can communities be confident that whomever is doing this outreach is being honest about the risks associated with hosting a facility?
Well, a couple thoughts that come to mind would be having a very candid conversation at the outset with the siting authority or whoever's proposing the project. Have a conversation up front about trust building behaviors. How do we want to engage with one another? What are our expectations of one another and of this process? And then there's an old saying, trust but verify. And again, trust may be too big a hill to climb right away, but I think I would advise representatives of the community to say, we want to hear from your experts, and we also want to be able to select our own. Ideally, and Tom talked about information integrity, we negotiate together some criteria for sourcing the information that we're going to need. What kinds of knowledge do we need? And how are we can we agree at the outset on how to decide whether information is accurate and whether information sources are credible or reliable? Maybe that's difficult to do in a tidy way. People are, it's natural to engage in motivated reasoning with so much at stake. But I would love to see communities at least insist on starting that conversation, and you can revisit it as necessary and sort of improve on those shared criteria.
I think just very, very quickly to pick up on that is that information, there's going to be a need to interrogate and validate information and question it. So you can develop a strategy where there may be local universities, local community groups who are trusted, but equally reach out to other communities who've been through the experience, because invariably there's no new question. that this question has been asked somewhere before. And so learn from other communities who don't have a vested interest, but do have the same experience as you do. They just be maybe an elder sibling have just done it before you've got around to doing it.
Well, thank you so much. We are at time. I apologize for not getting to all the questions from our audience, but Brad, Tom, Roy, really appreciate your being here. We will post a video of today's webinar on our website at spentfuelsolutionsnow.com. And also, as I mentioned, we'll post the links to the resources that you provided on our social media. I would encourage everyone to follow us if you are not already. So with that, thank you so much. We really appreciate all of your time and expertise today.
Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
opportunity.